The sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona desert as Captain Samuel Morrison wiped the sweat from his weathered brow. His small cavalry unit had been stationed at Fort Verde for 3 months, and tensions with the Apache tribes were reaching a dangerous peak. The year was 1876, and the government's push to relocate Native Americans to reservations had sparked fierce resistance across the territory. Morrison was not like other military officers. While his peers relied on brute force and overwhelming numbers, he spent his evenings studying Apache customs, learning their language, and understanding their tactical methods. His fellow soldiers often mocked him, calling him the Apache lover behind his back. They laughed when they saw him sitting alone, sketching maps and making notes about tribal movements and seasonal patterns. "What's the point of all that scribbling, Morrison?" Lieutenant Bradley had sneered just that morning. "These savages only understand the business end of a rifle." The other men had chuckled, but Morrison had simply continued his work in silence. The Apache chief, Nalnish, was known throughout the region as a brilliant strategist. His warriors moved like ghosts through the desert, striking supply convoys and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. 300 of the fiercest Apache warriors followed him, and they had successfully evaded capture for over 2 years. Previous military campaigns had failed miserably, resulting in heavy casualties and no meaningful progress. Morrison's commanding officer, Colonel Heartfelt, was growing increasingly frustrated. "The Department of War is breathing down my neck, Captain," he had told Morrison during their last meeting. "We need results, not more of your anthropological studies." The pressure was mounting, and Morrison knew that conventional military tactics would only lead to more bloodshed and failure. As evening approached, Morrison climbed to the highest point of the fort and gazed out at the vast expanse of desert. Somewhere out there, Nalnish and his warriors were planning their next move, but Morrison was formulating a plan of his own, one that would require patience, cunning, and a deep understanding of Apache culture that his fellow soldiers dismissed as madness. The other officers continued to ridicule his unconventional methods, unaware that Morrison was about to attempt something that would either secure his place in military history or end his career in disgrace. He understood that winning this conflict would require more than superior firepower. It would demand outsmarting one of the most brilliant military minds in the American Southwest. Morrison spent the next 2 weeks gathering intelligence from every possible source. He questioned traders who had dealings with the Apache, spoke with Mexican settlers who had lived in the region for generations, and even sought out a former Apache captive named Maria Santos, who had escaped 3 years earlier. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle he was assembling in his mind. The breakthrough came when Morrison learned about the seasonal movement patterns of the Apache bands. Unlike his fellow officers who saw the desert as empty wasteland, Morrison discovered that the Apache followed ancient routes tied to water sources, seasonal hunting grounds, and sacred sites. Maria Santos had mentioned something particularly interesting. During the autumn months, all the scattered Apache bands would converge at a hidden valley called Tseku for important ceremonies and winter preparations. "You're wasting time with these fairy tales." Lieutenant Bradley had scoffed when Morrison shared his findings with the other officers. "We should be out there hunting them down, not sitting here listening to ghost stories." Colonel Heartfelt remained skeptical, but allowed Morrison to continue his research, mainly because all previous aggressive approaches had failed spectacularly. Morrison's plan began to take shape as he studied the geography around Tseku Valley. According to his sources, the valley was accessible only through 3 narrow canyon passages, making it naturally defensible, but also potentially vulnerable if approached correctly. The Apache chose this location precisely because it seemed impregnable, but Morrison saw an opportunity where others saw only obstacles. He began making careful preparations, requisitioning supplies that seemed random and unnecessary to his fellow officers. Ropes, pulleys, mining equipment, and large quantities of food rations arrived at the fort. When questioned about these unusual requests, Morrison would only say he was preparing for an extended reconnaissance mission. The ridicule from his peers intensified, with some openly questioning his sanity. Morrison's finally lost his mind. He overheard Sergeant Collins telling a group of enlisted men, "He's ordering enough rope to hang every Apache in the territory." The laughter that followed stung, but Morrison remained focused on his plan. He knew that conventional military thinking would never succeed against Nalnish's tactical brilliance. As autumn approached, Morrison's network of informants confirmed that the Apache bands were indeed beginning to move toward Seku Valley. Nalnish himself had been spotted leading a large group of warriors in that direction. Morrison felt a mixture of excitement and terror. His theory was proving correct, but now came the most dangerous part of his plan. He would have to convince his superiors to trust his unconventional strategy, knowing that failure would likely result in a court-martial and the deaths of many good soldiers. The tension in Colonel Hartwell's office was thick, as Morrison spread his hand-drawn maps across the desk. His fellow officers stood around skeptically as he outlined his plan to capture Nalnish and his entire force without firing a single shot. The silence that followed his presentation was deafening. "You want to do what?" Colonel Hartwell asked, his voice barely concealing his disbelief. Morrison explained that instead of attacking the Apache directly, he proposed to seal them inside Seku Valley by blocking the 3 canyon entrances with carefully planned rock slides. The Apache would be trapped with their families, horses, and limited supplies, forcing them to negotiate rather than fight. Lieutenant Bradley was the first to voice his opposition. "This is the most ridiculous plan I've ever heard. You want to move tons of rock without being detected by the most alert warriors in the territory? It's impossible." The other officers nodded in agreement, but Morrison remained calm and methodical in his response. He had studied the canyon walls extensively and identified structural weaknesses where strategically placed explosives could trigger massive rock slides. The Apache guards would be focused on watching the valley floors and surrounding ridges, not the seemingly solid rock walls high above the canyon entrances. Morrison had even calculated the exact timing needed to seal all 3 passages simultaneously, preventing any chance of escape. "Sir, with respect, conventional attacks have failed repeatedly," Morrison addressed the colonel directly. "We've lost good men and accomplished nothing except making the Apache more determined to resist. This approach uses their own tactical strengths against them. They choose defensible positions, but that same trait makes them vulnerable to being contained." Colonel Hartwell studied the maps carefully, his finger tracing the canyon approaches Morrison had marked. The plan was undeniably clever, but it required precise execution and absolute secrecy. One mistake, one early detection by Apache scouts, and the entire operation would become a massacre. The political implications were staggering. If successful, it would be hailed as a bloodless victory. But failure would end all their careers. The debate continued for hours, with Morrison defending every aspect of his strategy against increasingly hostile questions. Finally, Colonel Hartwell made his decision. "Against my better judgment, Captain Morrison, I'm going to give you the chance to prove this isn't complete madness. You'll have 30 men and 1 week to position your equipment. But understand this, if your plan fails, if good soldiers die because of your unconventional thinking, you'll face a court-martial that will end with you in military prison." Morrison felt his heart racing as he realized his plan had been approved. Now came the truly challenging part: executing a complex military operation that required the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the stealth of the Apache themselves. Under cover of darkness, Morrison led his carefully selected team toward Seku Valley. He had chosen soldiers known for their stealth and reliability rather than their combat experience. Each man carried specialized equipment: explosives, detonation cables, and tools for scaling the canyon walls. The journey took 3 days, moving only at night and hiding during daylight hours to avoid Apache patrols. Morrison's heart pounded as they approached the first canyon entrance. His scouts confirmed that Nalnish's forces had indeed gathered in the valley below, with cooking fires visible and the sounds of children playing echoing off the canyon walls. The sight of families made Morrison pause. This wasn't just a military operation anymore. It was an action that would affect innocent people. But he knew that continued warfare would lead to far more suffering for both sides. The most dangerous part of the operation began as Morrison's men rappelled down the canyon walls in complete darkness. They had to place explosive charges at precisely calculated points while remaining absolutely silent. One dropped tool, one loose rock, and Apache sentries would discover them. Morrison watched from above as his demolition expert, Corporal Jenkins, worked by feel alone to position the charges that would bring down thousands of tons of rock. Hours passed like days as the team worked to prepare all 3 canyon entrances simultaneously. Morrison had established a complex system of mirror signals to coordinate the timing between the separate teams. Everything had to happen within minutes of each other, or the Apache would have time to escape through the unsealed passages. The pressure was overwhelming, knowing that dozens of lives depended on perfect execution. Just before dawn, Morrison's worst fear nearly materialized. An Apache warrior emerged from the shadows near the second canyon entrance, apparently checking the outer perimeter. Sergeant Miller, positioned as a lookout, held his breath as the warrior stopped directly below their rope lines. For several agonizing minutes, the Apache stood motionless, seeming to sense something unusual but unable to identify the threat. Finally, he moved on, and Morrison's team exhaled collectively. As the sun began to rise, Morrison gave the signal for final preparations. Each team confirmed their readiness through the mirror system he had devised. The explosive charges were in place, the detonation cables were connected, and his men were positioned safely away from the blast zones. Morrison checked his pocket watch. In exactly 10 minutes, he would either achieve the impossible or watch his career and reputation crumble along with the canyon walls. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as he realized there was no turning back. 300 Apache warriors, their families, and his own men's lives now hung in the balance of a plan that everyone had called madness. The earth shook with tremendous force as Morrison's carefully coordinated explosions triggered massive rock slides at all 3 canyon entrances simultaneously. The sound echoed across the desert like thunder, sending wildlife fleeing and creating dust clouds visible for miles. Within minutes, thousands of tons of rock had sealed Cheku Valley completely, trapping Chief Nalnish and his entire force inside. Morrison felt a mixture of triumph and terror as he realized his plan had worked exactly as predicted. The canyon entrances were completely blocked, with no possibility of escape on horseback. But now came the most delicate part of the operation, negotiating with one of the most formidable military leaders in the American Southwest who had just discovered he was trapped by an enemy he had never seen coming. Inside the valley, chaos erupted as the Apache warriors realized their situation. Nalnish quickly organized scouting parties to examine the blocked passages, but the rock slides were too massive and unstable to clear without heavy equipment they didn't possess. For the first time in his military career, the brilliant Apache chief found himself outmaneuvered by an opponent who had studied his methods and turned them against him. Morrison positioned himself on the canyon rim where his voice would carry clearly into the valley below. Using the Apache language he had spent months learning, he called out to announce his presence and intentions. The initial response was a volley of arrows that fell harmlessly short, but Morrison continued speaking calmly, explaining that he had not come to fight but to negotiate. "I am Captain Morrison of the United States Army," he called in carefully pronounced Apache words. "I know you are Chief Nalnish, a warrior of great honor and wisdom. I have sealed these canyons not to destroy you, but to speak with you as one military leader to another." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of horses and worried voices echoing off the canyon walls. Nalnish himself eventually appeared on a ledge below, close enough for conversation, but still maintaining tactical advantage within his trapped domain. The Apache chief was younger than Morrison had expected, with intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate every word and gesture. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise, revealing an education that surprised Morrison. "You have used great cunning to trap us, Captain Morrison," Nalnish said, his voice carrying both respect and controlled anger. "But you should know that Apache warriors do not fear death. If you think we will surrender our freedom to save our lives, you do not understand us as well as you believe." The challenge was clear, and Morrison knew that his next words would determine whether this confrontation ended in victory or tragedy. Morrison took a deep breath before responding, knowing that everything he had worked for, everything he had risked, would be decided in the conversation that was about to unfold between 2 military minds who had finally met face to face. The negotiation between Morrison and Nalnish continued for 3 days, with both leaders demonstrating the tactical brilliance that had brought them to this unprecedented confrontation. Morrison explained that he had no intention of harming the Apache families or forcing them onto reservations immediately. Instead, he proposed a gradual transition that would preserve Apache dignity while ending the cycle of violence that was destroying both cultures. Nalnish was impressed. Despite himself by Morrison's understanding of Apache values and his respectful approach to the situation, unlike other military officers who had dismissed Apache culture as primitive savagery, Morrison spoke knowledgeably about tribal traditions, seasonal movements, and the spiritual significance of the land. This unexpected respect began to create a foundation for meaningful dialogue. "You have shown that you understand our ways better than any white soldier we have encountered," Nalnish admitted during their second day of talks. "But understanding and trust are different things. How do we know that your promises will be kept when other treaties have been broken like dried grass in the wind?" Morrison knew this was the crucial moment that would determine success or failure. Morrison made a proposal that shocked everyone involved. He offered to remain in the valley as a hostage while a small group of Apache representatives traveled to Washington to negotiate directly with government officials. This unprecedented gesture of trust convinced Nalnish that Morrison was genuinely committed to finding a peaceful solution. The Apache chief agreed to surrender his weapons and accept relocation, but only under Morrison's personal guarantee of fair treatment. The surrender ceremony was unlike anything the American Southwest had ever witnessed. Instead of a humiliating defeat, Morrison orchestrated an event that honored Apache military prowess while acknowledging the reality of their situation. Nalnish and his warriors laid down their weapons with dignity, and Morrison saluted them as fellow soldiers rather than conquered enemies. Many of Morrison's own men were moved to tears by the profound respect shown between former adversaries. News of Morrison's bloodless victory spread rapidly throughout the territory and eventually reached Washington. The military officials who had once ridiculed his unconventional methods now praised his innovative approach to what had seemed an impossible situation. Morrison was promoted and given authority to implement similar peaceful resolutions with other resistant tribes. Years later, Nalnish would become a respected advocate for his people, working within the government system to protect Apache rights and culture. He often spoke of Morrison as the only white soldier who had defeated him, not through superior force but through superior understanding. The two men maintained a correspondence for the rest of their lives, their mutual respect transcending the cultural barriers that had once made them enemies. Morrison's mad plan had proven that military victory could be achieved through intelligence and cultural understanding rather than violence and destruction. His success challenged conventional military thinking and opened new possibilities for resolving conflicts between expanding American civilization and indigenous peoples defending their homeland. The captain, who had been ridiculed for studying his enemies instead of simply fighting them, had demonstrated that knowledge and respect were more powerful weapons than rifles and cavalry charges.